The theme for tonight's programme is the tempestuous loveliness of terror, as Professor Christopher Frayling joins Sarah O'Brien-Twigg to discuss the romantic obsession with pain and horror.
Romanticism, that youthful revolt against the tyranny of reason, took the lid off feelings. Any and every feeling and sensation became the fascinated object of their probing gaze. You could say the romantics were totally in love with their psyches. No holes were barred. As though compelled like the proverbial moth round a flame, they peeled back the veneer of rational civilization to reveal the natural being beneath. And what did they find? A bizarre bundle of raw sensations and emotions. Loneliness, fear, desire, love, eroticism, loathing. In particular, the borderline between sanity and madness. With me to discuss these issues, I have Dr. Christopher Frayling, Professor of Cultural History at the Royal College of Art. Christopher, so where do we begin with this wonderful brew of emotion and storm?
The phrase, the tempestuous loveliness of terror, comes from Shelley standing in front of a painting of the Medusa in the Uffizi Gallery in 1819. He stands in front of this picture of a severed head, vipers coming out of its hair, and full lips and blazing eyes, which most people in the 18th century would have said, yuck. And instead, he says, it is the tempestuous loveliness of terror. And it's an idea that is mirrored by an awful lot of romantics. Coleridge has an even better phrase, desire and loathing strangely mixed. And Goethe's Faust, when confronted with the witch's Sabbath, says, what delight, what woe, I cannot turn my eyes away. And this idea emerges from ideas of the sublime in the late 18th century, that when you stand in front of a natural disaster or an Alp or a huge building, you say, well, it's magnificent, it's scary, and the little hairs at the base of my spine go up when I think about it, but I'm going to call that sublime, and Edmund Burke starts that idea. By the time the Romantics come along, it's lost the moral, ethical edge to it, of identifying with the victims, and it's just fun. I mean, nasty things turn you on, and you find out things about what goes on inside your head by looking at the dark side of human nature. So the tempestuous loveliness of terror is the kind of eroticism of psychology, almost.
Are we going to say that this is the beginning of the modern world, really? That they discovered that love wasn't half as big a hold on the human imagination as horror and pain and nastiness, as you said?
Yes, to some extent, I think that's true. I mean, the idea wasn't to get lost in it. The idea was to sort of come back again and write about it. So you kind of dredge out this darkness in your, what subsequently became called the unconscious, and then you come back and write a poem about it. They were very suspicious of people who kind of wallowed in fantasy. That would come under the category of insanity. You cross the line there. You come back, you do a painting, you do a poem, you write a novel about it. And one gateway into all this was dreams. Whereas in the late 18th century, if you were a philosopher, you'd have spent your time trying to explain away what dreams were. You know, nightmares happen because you sleep on your back. Nightmares happen because your head is lower than your feet. Nightmares happen because you feel suffocated, because something's sitting on your chest. The fun for the Romantics was to say, I don't care about those reductive explanations. Let's enjoy, let's have a real nightmare and see if we can actually re-describe it in the morning. And if you look at Fuseli's painting, famous painting, The Nightmare of 1781, interestingly, he backs both horses in that coin a phrase. On the one hand, you've got all the explanations programmed into the painting. There she is sleeping on her back with her head lower than her feet, with this thing sitting on her chest, and a bottle on her dressing table, which might have all sorts of strange substances in it that she's been taking. It's another explanation of nightmares. But also, it's her fantasy. This is a personal thing. There's a mirror in the painting that doesn't reflect anything. There's nothing real going on. So the change from the 18th century is that it's gone inside. It's inside her head, and that is intrinsically interesting. And an awful lot of artists tried to artificially to stimulate those sort of nightmares. Fuseli himself ate raw pork chops late at night and went to sleep and hoped for the best. Others had prolonged bouts of vegetarianism followed by binges of undercooked meat. Southey liked laughing gas, which is quite a nice idea. And of course Byron did black drop, which is a compound of opium dissolved in alcohol. So, if it was in there, you could bring it out by these stimulants. An awful lot of other people tried, and there was nothing in there, so the romantic agony for them was really the guts ache and no poetry. But in the case of more sensitive individuals, it seemed to work.
One really rather fascinating aspect of this whole topic and the development of it has to be that a woman writes the first novel about what happens when you realize one of these nightmares.
Yes, a woman writes the first novel, and simultaneously, the most politically incorrect individual in Europe writes the first vampire story. And if I could be a fly on the wall for any two nights in history, I think it would have been at the middle of June 1816, overlooking Lake Geneva. Because you simultaneously have Mary Godwin, as she then was, coming up with this extraordinarily potent story about a sort of motherless child, a cybernetic birth. And the way in which she stimulated that dream was actually very interesting. It was Shelley, Byron, Mary Godwin, Claire Clairmont, Byron's ex-girlfriend, and the enigmatic Dr. Polidori, who looked after Byron's needs, particularly prescribing opium whenever he needed it, were all together getting on each other's nerves. It's raining, it's a wet summer, they couldn't play Scrabble, they were above such things. It was one of those holidays that went spectacularly wrong. And so they decided to have a family bet. And interestingly, the family bet is stimulated by a volume of German ghost stories that happens to be in the house. It's an anonymous volume called the Phantasmagoriana, or Collection of Tales of Horror, which had been translated into French, and Mary found it, in fact. And the first story is all about a group of sensitive individuals in a brotherhood sitting together and deciding to scare each other witless. So they thought, well, this will be fun, let's try it. She did have a dream, and it was a dream about a motherless child, about a cybernetic birth, which is very poignant, obviously, for the daughter of the founding mother of women's liberation, but also who'd lost her own child about a year before. You've got a metaphor, a kind of gothic romantic metaphor for all sorts of psychosexual tensions that were going on from the feminine point of view. Now, simultaneously, Byron tells the first vampire story in world literature, all about this mean, moody and magnificent man, Lord Ruthven, who wanders around society London, debauching young men and women both. And Byron lost interest, and Dr. Polidori steps in, rewrites the story, brings it out three years later, and it becomes, ironically, Lord Byron's most popular work in Europe, even though he never wrote it. Goethe referred to the vampire as the English poet's finest work, which must have really upset him, because he had nothing to do with it. I mean, Polidori, in fact, wrote it, and it causes this enormous craze. But the volume of German ghost stories is, I think, the trigger. It does appear also that the team went down the Rhine on a little excursus and visited Castle Frankenstein, did a sort of detour from Geneva and came back again. So German Romanticism impacts with the English Gothic. By the 1820s, boulevard versions of The Vampire and Frankenstein are at every major theatre in Paris, Berlin and London. It really is one of the very first popular crazes of modern literature. And in 1827, there comes an opera by Heinrich Marschner with the libretto by his brother-in-law, August Wöhlbrugg, where Lord Ruthven, Byron's vampire, turns into the central character of an opera. And in one sense was the first example in modern literature of an idea originating in, as it were, high art with the poets, Shelley, Byron, and indeed before that Goethe and Lenore, going into the bloodstream via the media that are available to it, opera, popular melodramas, and it ends up in Victorian comics about 15 years later, Penny Dreadfuls. And before we know where we are, we're into horror movies. And I think it's the first example of that diffusion of a cultural form to have happened in European literature. Simultaneously, and some would argue in the same world, although I think he's a cut above that world, you have E.T.A. Hoffmann in Germany writing supernatural short stories, which are the basis of many of the great stories that are still hanging around at midnight on television or around clanking video machines. Hoffmann used to be treated as a kind of reach-me-down supernatural horror writer, but people are beginning to re-examine his work to see him as much more central to German Romanticism. Although, as a writer, he sometimes had L-plates, the themes that he's dealing with are very close to poets like Novalis or philosophers like Heine. He decides, in nearly all his stories, to include both the explanation and the supernatural side by side.